As we enter into Summerland in 2024, I thought I'd highlight Glen Haven and the Sleeping Bear Dunes in the Michigan National Lakeshore. This community, now park, up on the pinky finger of the Michigan Mitten, was part of the sprawling freshwater communities of fishing, hunting, fur trapping, and plant harvesting that went on in the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi communities. But in the middle of the 19th century, America was in the full swing of timber madness. Sawmills were being mechanized, lumber, firewood, and charcoal were all being produced at astonishing rates, and timbering outposts were all the rage, especially in places like Glen Haven that were on the water, so all the wood products could be easily transported to growing urban and manufacturing areas. These outposts were also a destination of much of the growing selection in canned food. People who were spending all their time turning trees into saleable wood products had no time to hunt or butcher or put up food for the winter, especially when they didn't bring any women along to do the food work. Of course, the fun part is that about 70 years after its founding, Glen Haven would get into the business of harvesting, packing, and canning fruit itself, and then sending that out into the world. So I'd recommend heading north in Michigan to check out the wilds, especially when it gets too hot and muggy further south. You can see the boats people would take before there were roads that far up. And just for fun, you can even see some of the Lake Michigan sand dunes. These are intact since they're so far north, but many dunes just like them were mined to make, yep, you guessed it, American glass. So come see parts of the entire American canning cycle that are present at the Sleeping Bear Dunes Park at the northwest edge of the Michigan Mitten. Episode 118, Radical Changes to 19th Century Food Storage, but mostly just the metal can part. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week will be the first part in the big topic of how glass and metal radically altered food storage in the 19th century. There'll be a detour through pie and potting history, and why the lack of a pH scale made botulism more likely. I do answer the canning versus tinning question, but there's too much to get all the way through the American bottled foods. So on theme, I took on too much for one episode, and some will just have to be stored for next week. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that people have long known that sealing food up away from the world in a way that kept water from getting in or out was important. But nobody was able to put all the pieces together and explain why until 1861. It was Louis Pasteur that finally figured out all the pieces. There was sterile plus oxygen and the exclusion of bugs, germs, bacteria, those tiny growing things that like to eat our food and poison us to keep us out. Look, it's going to take a while to figure out how to name these little creepy crawlies. But even with the development of germ theory and the rudiments of sterile technique, we don't quite have a handle on botulism because the natural world doesn't play favorites at all. As I've mentioned on and off, for as long as people have managed to get their hands on more food than they can eat right away, they have known that leaving food out and uncovered in human comfy temperatures meant that food, sooner or later, is going to go bad. Some of it later, like root vegetables, sturdy fruits like squash and citrus and apples, and grains, and some of it goes bad sooner, things like meat and dairy, tender herbs, soft fruits, and seafoods. And for almost as long as people have been gathering foods, they've been coming up with ways to preserve that food. We've covered many of these methods. The main ones, drying, smoking, salting, pickling, and even sugar preserving, have been covered a couple of times. And we'll be returning to them. I've even touched base with the fat-based and pie-based methods. And because they have the most to do with the development of bottling and canning, it's time to take a closer look at them. Way back in Season 1, I spoke about pie for the first time in Episode 15. I touched on fat preservation in Episode 35 and what liquid gold fat was back in the day, and went in a little deeper in my pie episodes 57 and 58. The air exclusion method for long keeping also comes up in episode 84 and 110, the pemmican episodes. The pie or pasty or dumpling has long been recognized as a way to cook food and keep it safe and sweet for a day or two, or maybe even longer if the crust is very thick. The cook would create a sort of coffin for the food within, where every bit of space is taken up by a thick gelatinous gravy or some solid fat. Many a Christmas pie was made with birds caught in the autumn and then sealed up in a sturdy crust of fat, salt, and flour, filled to the brim with a thick gravy and topped with lard or butter. This would last a month or two in the cold room as long as the crust wasn't breached. A similar trick could be pulled off with meat pounded into pastes with plenty of fat, farces as they were often known, and placed in a ceramic pot or jar of some sort. These would be cooked slowly in gently simmering or boiling water for a few hours and topped with a cap of fat. Tallow, lard, or clarified butter were the preferred tops. The completed concoction was then sealed with greased leather as a final protective measure. These potted meats kept well but were not particularly portable and were generally regarded as luxuries due to the amount of fat and labor that went into them. And unlike a barrel of, say, pickled pork or that lump of hard smoked beef, once a pot of meat was broken into, it pretty much had to be all eaten up. Breaking the seal put the potted meat back on the road to rot, which of course is one reason using up farce in pies was possible. The unpotted farce could be less vulnerable to rot again by walling it up in a pie. But enter the glass bottle. Though these were rare, somewhat unwieldy and expensive, they were pretty sturdy and had the remarkable quality of not reacting with the stuff inside. Some acidic foods could react with the glazes on ceramics, and after prolonged use, ceramic vessels tended to develop cracks that made them less useful as preserving containers. So despite their expense and rarity, glass bottles were occasionally employed to preserve a few things besides just rum and mystery alchemical substances. All the way back in 1747, Hannah Glass, in her Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, explained a method where gooseberries were placed in clean, dry jars, which were then placed in gently boiling water, the tops out of the water, until the gooseberries inside were coddled, that is, gently cooked. Then corks were dipped in melted rosin, a sealing compound made from sticky tree sap, and the hot jars were sealed up. And then the jars were left to cool and could be opened at any point months afterward to reveal perfectly sound gooseberries. The thick jars of the day meant that they would be fine with all of this thermal back and forthing, but the narrow necks of the bottles meant that what could be put in a glass jar for preserving was limited. Things like gooseberries, peas, cherries, and raspberries. Fun tidbit, a recent excavation at Mount Vernon found some walled-up glass jars from right before the Revolutionary War that contained cherries. Well, okay, the remains of cherries. The seals on the bottles had been broken, so exactly how those cherries had been put up is unknown. They might have been preserved dry, like the recipe for the gooseberries, but they could have also been preserved in a sugared syrup, which was common for as long as rich people had been importing sugar from island plantations in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. But it is most likely that they had been preserved in a mixture of sugar and brandy, since Washington was known to be a big fan of cherry bounce, which I covered back in episode 78, the one on mixed drinks that are definitely not cocktails. So the idea that sealing foods in a liquid retaining way with fats was long established. Cooked foods, meat and fish especially, sunk in olive oil or sealed in a coat of hard animal fats was pretty common. Think confit or conservas. As glass bottles became a bit more common, the idea of sealing up hot fruit inside glass came along, which meant that by the 1800s, people had been fiddling about with putting jams and syrups and sticky sugary liquors, vinegars, ketchups, and cordials into glass for a while now. So what drove food preparation to the next level? Partly tinkering with the new tech, partly the rise of the wealthy class that had liquid wealth to spend. Yes, the 18th century is the beginning of the cash age, when there's just more precious metal or specie money in the world. thanks to the Spanish silver mines in South America. Oh, and partly, it's war. Nicolas Appert, a Frenchman, is generally credited as being the father of bottled foods. It seems he was the first person to get really thoughtful and systematic about the food bottling thing. He was also a bit of a clean freak. His constant vigilance about cleanliness set him apart in his age and likely helped with the success of his bottled foods ventures. By about 1804, he had a pretty good business going, supplying French naval officers and other fairly wealthy people expected to spend time at sea with vegetables and pretty fair meat. But he was a terrible businessman. The food bottling business, as he ran it, had a few things holding it back. First, the bottles were all pretty small, so you could only put smallish stuff in there. And the meat, while sweet or completely unrotted, was incredibly overcooked. Now, while at sea and the choices were overcooked bottled beef or somewhat putrid salt pork or salt possibly beef, the consistency of firewood, that bottled beef actually looked pretty great. But on land, not many people were that excited about it, except soldiers who were faced with regularly dire fare. And Napoleon, with his conquests about the European continent, meant lots of soldiers in lots of wars. And of course, France was very short of sugar with the explosion of Saint-Domingue into Haiti. So figuring out how to preserve fruit without a ton of sugar syrup became highly interesting. Appert was also apparently obsessed with improving his process and upgrading his equipment. Yet when it came to protecting the intellectual property, the IP of his process, or marketing his products, he could barely be bothered. He kept writing down and publishing the results of his improvements. The first public acknowledgement of his process came in 1803, while he kind of made a living at it for a while with naval officers and such. He never got to wealthy or even particularly comfortable or stable. Maybe there should be a fund that entrepreneurs who manage to make a ton of money off these original ideas should have to pay into to help with the upkeep of these obsessed but indispensable inventor types. Anyway, Appert was buried in a common pauper's grave when he died at 91. Likely because he'd driven his family away with his obsession. His wife left him when he was in his 50s, and he died heavily in debt despite altering the way the world keeps food. Appert not only came up with the bottling process and shared it with France and then the world, in the 1840s he was also instrumental in figuring out how to heat up food and drop the temperatures quickly so cooking times could be tracked precisely. This included the development of tubs that filled and drained quickly and the use of pressurized heated chambers known as autoclaves or retorts. Pressurizing the atmosphere meant heating could go higher than 212 Fahrenheit or 100 C. The cans could be heated for a shorter period of time to make them safe, and it helped stop the bottles and later metal cans from exploding during the heating process. See, out here in the 1 atmosphere of pressure club, more or less, the maximum temperature any water-containing food can reach is right around 212 Fahrenheit or 100 C, boiling temperature for water. Once all the water has converted to gas, well, then things can get hotter, but not until then. The short reason for this is that water is an energy hog, and it will take every scrap of energy it can get its hands on to turn its molecules from cozy water to chaotic gas. And the temperature, that measure of molecular chaos, is held at the boiling point until that conversion from liquid to gas is completed. But if you raise the pressure over water, the temperature at which the water molecules can jump into gas also rises, which is why cans in a pressure chamber can get cooked at higher temperatures. This, of course, is the same reason water boils at lower temperatures at higher elevations. There's less air pressure over the water, so the water can make the jump to gas at a lower temperature. As a result, beans and potatoes take absolutely forever to cook at higher elevations, and why Bolivians adore their pressure cookers. Anyway, back to canning. When we cook food in the open air, the plan is to eat it pretty soon, So for the most part, whatever creepy crawlies it may have are dead or so sparse we're pretty much fine. But the food in the bottles and the cans, well, the plan was to have them hang around for a while, possibly a really long while. And if there's anything in there that can grow and feast on the food inside, they have plenty of time in the dark and undisturbed to get up to no good. In 1802, the chemist Guy Lassac was looking over the work of this other chemist guy, Lavoisier, and Lavoisier had figured out that oxygen was a gas and an element, and he spelled the end of the whole phlogiston idea. Anyway, Guy Lassac took oxygen one step further and was able to show that lots of stuff dies when you take away not just air, but oxygen specifically. Candle flames, bugs, mice, etc. So bottling and canning were thought to work because the food couldn't rot because the oxygen was all removed, which was partly, often, mostly true. Cook the food, keep it sealed up from the air, and it's safe for a really long time. Like I said, mostly true, but not completely. It is time for us to meet Clostridium botulinum, the anaerobic bacteria. That is, a bacteria that doesn't need molecular oxygen to live. It's also the one that makes botulinum toxin. Yep, the one in Botox. And when botulinum toxin gets into your digestive system and runs around touching all your nerves in and around there, it can slow down or stop the whole works enough to kill you. Now, for what it's worth, when Botox is injected into your forehead or sweat glands or whatever, it's paralyzing them, which is why all those Hollywood types have those weird wooden face things going on. People might look silly or as if they lack emotion, but they're not actually dead. What kills you is when the toxin gets loose and stops your heart and lungs and stuff. Anyway, the C. botulinum bacteria normally can't do much. Most of the time, with oxygen around, all the other aerobic bacteria and fungi and molds totally outcompete it, which is why you're fine if you just cut the fuzzy bits off cheese. But in environments without oxygen, not much else can grow, which means slow, plodding C. botulinum can really get going if it isn't killed. Now, up until our particular period in time, it generally was killed. Stored stuff was in alcohol or acid environments or went through long cooking. All the vinegars and ketchups and cordials were poison to C. botulinum. And the 17th and 18th century habit of cooking pies for an hour and potting farces for 2 or more hours in the water bath also completely did in the little bugs. And the little bottles Appert was using were small enough to generally get heated through well enough. So Appert got his French government award and acclaim and published his book in 1809. But across La Manche, the Channel, some people had figured out it didn't need to be bottles. And they were terrible on boats anyway. Why not use steel cans? The decision was made to line steel containers with tin because the iron base of steel was too reactive with food. And tin was plentiful in England, where they also already had a long history of using it to line pots. Lead, of course, had also been used to line and make pots, but that seemed to make the ruling class, that is, the people who could afford it, into a bunch of drooling dummies. Oh yeah, and tin was much stronger than lead for this purpose. So, by 1810, canned food, that is, food in hand-constructed steel cans lined with tin and filled with gravy and sealed and cooked, went to sea and didn't kill anyone. In fact, compared to the other rations available at sea, they were pretty good. Remember, kids, the food at sea was the lowest of all low bars. Losing a fifth to a third of the crew to diseases of malnourishment was pretty normal on a long voyage. So the food not killing people, even if it didn't taste great, was counted as proof of concept. And the first tin can factory was opened by Donkin, Gamble, and Hill of the Dartford Iron Works. And once things got rolling, 2 skilled men could turn out 120 cans each day. These cans were hand-built, hand-soldered, and had to be opened using a hammer and chisel. The cans were loaded with the desired food, The top was placed on and a small gravy hole was left in the top, where gravy or other liquid would be poured in, pushing out every last bit of air. The hole would be plugged shut with a patch and more solder, and the cooking process could be completed. This meant that the canned food was expensive and treated as something of a luxury. The food inside the cans was terrible compared to fresh food, but was absolute magic when compared to rotten food or no food. The goodness or the badness of early canned food definitely depended on context. And since there were still pretty regular famines in the early 19th century, there were times when canned food looked not just great, but positively miraculous. To make up for the trouble that making cans was, ever bigger cans, ones that held up to 17 pounds of food, that is, just shy of 8 kilos, were made. Getting those cooked and heated to the proper temperature for the proper amount of time, well, that had to be something, or something very risky. And because there were so few ways to effectively preserve meat, especially in ways that didn't make it semi-impossible to eat, and meat was still regarded as a luxury, it was also the most common candidate for canning. However, meat on an acid-base scale is pretty close to neutral and sometimes even a little basic. And this is where the botulinum comes in. Things like tomatoes and orange marmalade and apple butter and such have something of an acidic tang, often enough acid to do in the C. botulinum, but not meat. And at this point, no one had figured out the botulism dyes and acid connection, largely because there was not a pH scale at this point. That's a 1909 invention. Sure, people understood acid and basic, that was grasped. But at this point, to know how acid or basic something was, you had to do a bunch of steps of adding different solutions and looking at shades of green and yellow and orange and red and pink and purple and blue to see how acidic or basic something was, and that was laborious. So no, the connection between enough acid and killing botulinum bacteria wasn't made and wouldn't be made until well into the 20th century. As it was with most diseases, the name came first. Botulism was definitively identified, or at least named, in 1735, and the paralytic qualities of the disease were tied to some incorrectly cured and prepared sausages. Now, the Latin name for sausages is botulus, thus the name for the disease. But it would take a little while before botulism and canned food were connected, because in the early days of canned food, people would die for lots of reasons, and canned food was largely a novelty and no one was eating much of it yet. No one but soldiers and sailors, as emergency rations quite often. And like I said, back then, people, especially soldiers and sailors, were dying for lots of reasons. But then, in 1849, the mechanical manufacture of cans began. Now, 2 unskilled workers could crank out 1,500 cans a day. That's over 12 times as many cans as the 120 per day routine. And the workers could be unskilled, so paid less. And from there, better designs were developed, better openers, bye-bye hammer and chisel, and some cans even came with their own keys. What it all came out to is that faster production of the cans meant making canned food was real business. So everyone was trying to figure out how it all worked and how to make a profit. And everyone agreed it was helpful if your customers didn't die when they ate your food. So the one thing people could definitely agree on is that if you cooked the absolute living dickens out of the food inside, the food was going to be safe. And with large factories and gas and coal burners and the introduction of pressurized chambers and fast-moving production, kept contamination to a minimum. Sure, long cooking times meant mush inside, but generally not poisonous mush. And then there was the habit of cans to bulge suspiciously or have frightful, stinky contents when things went wrong. And that kept most consumers safe. Safe-ish. Well, safe enough. Again, compared to all the other foodborne risks and just general hazards of daily life that included little soap and, as of yet, no germ theory, so no antibiotics, the risks of canned food compared to, say, daily life were fairly low. And because it could be regarded as generally safe and long-lasting, canned preserved food began to spread as sort of an emergency ration in wealthy pantries and in the military, and occasionally as an exciting novelty from time to time. The British went with the term tinned food and Americans went with canned. And if anything, canned food was the beginning of the end for the pies with coffin-like inedible crusts. The pastry and the dumpling will definitely live on, but now the crusts will tend to be edible, because canning your meat was a much better bet than salt crust dough. But this also meant that potted meat, it was on its way from changing from something of a luxury pantry item to just weird little cans that will be sneered at by people who don't understand the history. Oh yeah, and Spam. The modern final evolved form of potted meat is probably Spam. But how that all happens, that's later. What's important right now is that a few decades into the 19th century, cheaper glass was on the rise. More efficient furnaces, especially with the introduction of coal to the heating process, meant large puddles of glass could be made available. American sand, American fuel, and the complete and utter lack of any sort of child labor protection meant blowing glass, while a skilled trade would turn into a bulk manufacture enterprise. And it is that glass jar, in the process of transforming from a curiosity to a status symbol to a common utilitarian object, that will complete this 19th century transformation of storing food. And I'll cover that and why 19th century factories have the windows they do next week. Thanks for listening. And a big thank you to all of you adding your reviews. Due to the fractured pod world out there, I can only see things written by people in the American bubble. But I'm so glad to see that the audience is widening. It makes it all worth it. You can reach out to me on my various social medias or email greetings, questions, or quibbles at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Want more food and history in your future? I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength. It's our much looser and rather wilder podcast called Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. There's still food, but now it has fashion and fighting and fraud and a few other F's, which means that, well, one F's for fun as opposed to this, which strives to be E for everyone. Right now, we're working our way through some of the historical context, fight scenes, and just all the drama of the stylish miniseries Shogun. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere on the social medias as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.